International humanitarian law is currently more important and relevant than ever. You may have heard on the news, or even on social media, about, for instance, possible war crimes being committed in conflict situations, such as those in Syria, in Ukraine, or Yemen. But under which circumstances is IHL actually applicable? Welcome to this module on the scope of application of international humanitarian law. My name is Emma Irving, and I'm an Assistant Professor of Public International Law here at Leiden University. In this module, I will introduce you to the concepts of international and non-international armed conflicts, and you will see which rules come into play for these two types of war. Now, let's look at some examples which might amount to a so-called armed conflict, to understand the main conditions for triggering the applicability of IHL. Since 2011, a brutal war has been fought in Syria between multiple parties. In this armed conflict, for over 7 years, different rebel groups have been fighting against Assad's government as a result of the Arab Spring. Both sides have received military and financial support from third states. Meanwhile, the terrorist group ISIS has taken control over part of Syrian territory, which has led to bombings from countries including the US, France, and Russia. In the context of this conflict, civilians have been targeted, chemical weapons seem to have been used, cultural property has been destroyed, and fighters have been captured and tortured. Let me give you another example of a modern conflict situation. In 2014, after a series of demonstrations and the removal from power of the Ukrainian president, Russian troops took over Crimea, an area in the south of Ukraine, and subsequently annexed it. A few months later, Russian soldiers conducted several attacks on Ukrainian territory, thereby supporting pro-Russian rebels operating in the eastern part of the country. The conflict in Ukraine has resulted in thousands of victims and has led to the death of a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was monitoring the security situation on the ground. While a lot of attention has been focused on the conflict in Syria and the Ukraine, the conflict in Yemen and the resulting humanitarian crisis did not initially gather as much attention. For over a decade, there have been tensions in Yemen between the government and a number of rebel groups. When President Hadi's government was overthrown in the spring of 2015, an international coalition of 9 states, led by Saudi Arabia, launched a military intervention in Yemen in order to fight against the rebels. Recently, certain published reports have indicated that civilians, among others, have fallen victims to attack, including while attending a wedding and a funeral. These are just 3 examples of modern conflict situations involving a plurality of actors. Yet how do we actually analyse a conflict? There are several important factors to consider when analysing a conflict. First of all, when is IHL applicable? Are we dealing with an international or a non-international armed conflict? What does the involvement of the different factions mean for the characterisation of a conflict? From which moment are civilians protected by the rules of IHL in such cases? Finally, when does a non-international armed conflict become an international armed conflict? To answer these questions, we will introduce you to the concepts of international and non-international armed conflict and explain which rules come into play for these two types of war. You will also become familiar with the special situations of belligerent occupation, foreign intervention, and non-international armed conflicts which have a spillover effect into neighbouring countries. At the end of this module, you will be able to classify current conflicts, such as those in Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen, and you will also be able to indicate which rules protect the victims of war in such cases. So please explore with us the scope of application of international humanitarian law and learn how to classify conflicts in this context.